Hey everybody, we're back with our awesome guest interviews. I hope you've enjoyed our Summer of Professional Development bonus episodes. If not, check out episodes 29, 30, 31 and 33 that cover everything from unlocking creativity in the classroom through to developing innovative professional development using FedEx Days. You can find all of that over at the website at inspirationforteachers.com. Now back to this week's awesome interview. Enjoy the show.
Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Welcome to another episode of Inspiration for Teachers. I'm your host, Kelly Long, and I'm super excited to have our inspirational educator on the show today, Debra Kidd. Debra trained as an English and drama teacher. She's been a manager, a consultant, a teacher trainer, and an AST for developing pedagogy. Welcome to the show, Debra.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, before we dive into your educational challenge of building an assessment and curriculum model that aims to take the lid off learning and value the whole child, I can't wait to get into that. What we do is we take a moment for you to say hello to our listeners and fill in the blanks from the intro.
Well, I taught for 21 years. I've taught across the spectrum from early years foundation stage through to higher education, which has been really interesting actually, because what you realise is that human beings don't actually change that much as they grow up. And I think I left teaching in July of last year, and this is my first year of being completely full-time out of the classroom. And it's been really interesting to go from school to school and see how differently people do things, and also quite heartening actually, because sometimes the narratives we get either from government or failing schools or from unions that teachers are depressed and down. And when you go into schools and when you go into lots of different schools, what you see is people getting on with the job as cheerfully and joyfully as they possibly can. And I think that's really positive and heartening.
That's so nice to hear, because we do get all of that negativity rammed down our throats, and I guess to a certain extent, if you hear it enough times, you start to believe it, don't you?
You do, definitely.
So I like to know that we're all kids at heart, no matter how old we are.
Yeah.
And we all sit there at the back of the class whispering and pretending not to do any work, so that's great to know that. But what we're going to do now, Debra, is we're going to move on to an immediate deep knowledge dive into what you can share with us. And what I have been asking my previous guests on the show was a question surrounding teaching and learning, and to find out what was the key to that. But we're shifting the topic discussion a little bit now, and we're going to look at how to manage and how to deal with difficult behaviour. Just for clarity purposes, I've come up with a learner called Fred. So apologies to any listener out there that's called Fred. As a teacher, you don't connect with Fred on any level whatsoever. He's doing his utmost to sabotage your authority and your lessons. He's disengaged, rude, sometimes aggressive and manipulative. What workable ideas have you had in your 21 years of experience that have worked when you have been in that situation that's incredibly frustrating? What could you draw upon? What could you advise anyone that is in that situation to do?
It's quite difficult because I don't think I've ever encountered a child that I haven't been able to engage with on any level whatsoever. I've come across lots of Freds, but there's always been something. And I think it's partly digging down into finding out what they like, what interests them, what makes them tick. What I've found with even the most difficult children is that fundamentally they want to be liked. And that often what they're doing is they're pushing every boundary, frequently because they've been let down a lot of times in their own lives, and they're pushing every boundary with you to prove that they're unlikable. So, with the most challenging and the most difficult children I've worked with, it's been about building positive relationships and never ever losing control of yourself so that you give them the ammunition they need to prove that they're not worth liking, if that makes sense. Now that sounds really soft, but actually what those children also often need are kind of, boundaries and discipline that meets their needs. So I'm not suggesting that we just sit around, have a cup of tea and a biscuit and a chat about football. There still needs to be the boundary of expectations, then there still needs to be this kind of routine that's in place, because a lot of those children need a routine. But it's knowing how to connect with them, I think. My good friend Hal Roberts talks about lessons worth behaving for, and he gets a lot of flack for it. But he works with some of the really challenging children who've been thrown out of mainstream schools into special settings. And he talks about, making the material matter to them, making it relevant to them, sort of pulling them in on a hook of engagement. So I don't think we can separate behaviour and pedagogy out. I think that's really vital, but nor can we ignore the importance of relationships.
And is there ever, this is very controversial, but is there ever a cut-off point where the teacher can't do anything more? They've tried everything and nothing is working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think support from senior leaders is vital, and support from the wider community. Sometimes these children need extra help, whether that's psychological support, counselling support, or medical support sometimes. So having really strong, effective networks across your whole school system is important. And there are children who just can't function in mainstream school, who for whatever reason cannot function. So I support the move of children into those settings that are more geared up to coping with them. But those settings then need to be properly funded and properly supported. What we have at the moment, I think, is a bit of a tendency towards a zero tolerance attitude towards discipline, where children are being thrown out of school for, fairly minor misdemeanors like, uniform compliance or punctuality or, low-level disruption in these zero tolerance settings, and they've got nowhere else to go. So if we keep on excluding children, we have to make sure that we've got the facilities to support them and that we're not ruining the rest of their lives.
And I guess that those facilities do teach to a high standard, because I've met a few kind of trainee teachers that have come in from those settings, that they've been working in those challenging units, and I can't believe some of the stuff that goes on. It's like, just if they just turn up to class, that's acceptable and that's good enough. And it's like, hang on a second, aren't you meant to be educating these children?
Yeah, I think there's a vast discrepancy in the quality of provision. I mean, you get somewhere like, for example, Springwell Academy in Barnsley, which is just an outstanding provider, where the quality of education is, sits at the heart of what they do. But that quality of education is wrapped up in a whole lot of emphasis on care and respectful relationships and all that kind of thing. And then there are obviously other settings which are more babysitting settings, if you like, and those children really struggle to go back into mainstream. They're behind educationally, but they also haven't had the support they need in order to be able to deal with routines when they re-enter. So it just becomes a self-perpetuating problem.
It's such a fascinating area, and I'm always keen to learn from other people about behaviour, because, no matter how big your toolkit is, at some point you come across someone and you're just like, wow, I've met my match now, and now I need to dig deep to figure out a strategy here.
That strategy can't always be done in the moment. So I think, I've had lessons where I've had to exit a child because I've just been at a loss as to what to do. And it may have taken me weeks or even months to figure out that strategy. And that's the point at which you need a really strong senior management team support network who'll come in and swoop it up for you. So I think it's a multifaceted problem, and it needs to be across the whole school.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us on that one, Debra. But we're going to now shift the focus slightly, and we're going to put you in the centre of our educational campus and find out from you in 60 seconds what really excites you about the teaching profession and what you would most like to change and why.
What really excites me at the moment, I think, is that there's a bit of a subversive mood bubbling up. And I wonder if it's partly because of the result of the general election, if teachers are starting to think we're going to have to do something ourselves, taking control, taking the reins themselves pedagogically and in terms of policy as well, I think. And that's really exciting. I think the major problem we have at the moment in the country educationally is our reliance on data, and a blind reliance on data. And it's leading too many schools to make things look all right, or to try and make things look all right for Ofsted without really looking at the whole child.
Because that is exactly what Ofsted do when they come in, isn't it? The first thing they want to see is your data, and are you closing the gap, and and all of that. And if you can't prove that you're doing that, and if you don't have a ton of evidence to demonstrate it, you're on really dodgy ground, aren't you?
You are, and I think credit should be given to people like Sean Harford and before him Mike Claddenbowl at Ofsted for really trying to look hard at the weaknesses of that system. And they have made some improvements, for example, dropping graded lesson observations and that kind of thing. But whenever Ofsted make any kind of announcement, there's always an unintended outcome because schools are just too ready to try and second guess what they want. So marking workloads, for example, have just become so excessive that they're just unmanageable because people think that's what Ofsted want because they're looking at progress over time. And it's the same thing with data. People will fill in spreadsheets to try and make colours turn the right colour so that they can justify their existence to Ofsted, when in fact the reality of what's happening to children doesn't always match that data. So I think until we step back and we start to trust schools a little bit more and we start to look at a bigger picture than just the raw data, we're just going to have that problem repeating itself.
Vic Goddard, in his episode with me, said some very interesting things about looking at the community and looking at the children that are coming through your school and focusing on what is specifically relevant to them in terms of their education and, to a certain extent, pushing what Ofsted are looking for to the side. Because as long as you're adding value to your learners, then that's the biggest thing that you should be doing in your school.
Yeah, absolutely. And having the courage of your convictions, somebody like Vic will hold on to his own convictions. Tom Sherrington, his latest blog post that challenges the Secretary of State's definitions of coasting schools, is really powerful because what he's talking about and what Vic talks about is meeting the needs of their school community and their children. So that means questioning things like the EBAC. Is it really in every child's best interest to do the EBAC, for example? And what we get in return to those kinds of questions is that we're setting up a culture of low expectations. But you don't have to be from a working class background or on free school meals to want to be an electrician rather than an academic. And I think we really need to have a proper conversation about what the purpose of education is, what the function of education is, and how we deliver that for the needs of our children.
Well, my husband is an accountant and he often says that he would rather be an electrician. So I think those skill sets are very much overlooked, and I think we need to give those people those skills because not everybody is going to be a solicitor, not everybody wants to be. So I definitely think looking at that whole child is really important. So we're going to spin the focus of our conversation slightly now, Debra, and we're going to look at your thought-provoking ideas regarding your educational challenge. But just before we do, you can find Debra's show notes on our podcast page at inspirationforteachers.com. We'll also be tweeting out key themes and ideas from the episode via our Twitter handle at inspiration40 and via Debra at
Debra Kidd.
Excellent. So, Debra, let's go on that journey with you now and set the scene for our listeners and describe your professional challenge and some solutions or ideas that you think our listeners could start considering or implementing in their own educational sphere.
Well, I think it goes back to that question of what is education for? What's the purpose of education? And in my last job, I was charged with the responsibility of redeveloping the Key Stage 3 curriculum I suppose there were two strands to it, really. How do we develop a curriculum model that stretches and challenges Key Stage 3, that doesn't treat Year 7s as the Year 0 year, which a lot of secondary schools make the mistake of doing? But also, how do we put kind of deep moral purpose at the heart of learning so that children are asking big questions about the world? And so we came up with a course called English and Philosophy, but it actually incorporated PHSE and RE and drama and lots of other aspects of sort of SMSC curriculum. And what we tried to do is put a big philosophical question at the heart of each term's learning and a book so that every child engaged with a text that acted as a kind of portal into that question. And we asked children to develop portfolios of writing, but we did very little writing in lesson times. What we were trying to do is inspire them with a sense of purpose that they wanted to write outside of lesson time. And at the end of Year 7, we started to think, well, how do we assess this? Because what we found was that the children might be meeting their literacy targets or their RE targets or whatever, but they were doing far more than that. They were exhibiting some learner behaviours that were just not accessible in our current system. So we came up with an assessment system that we call Assessing for Living, And at the end of the academic year in both year 7 and 8, and they now do it in year 9, those children had to write a long essay in response to a philosophical question that pulled in learning right from across the curriculum. So the question might be, is life a postcode lottery, or will there always be poverty, or is happiness achievable for everyone? You know, those kinds of questions. Year 7 would write 2,000 words, year 8 3,000, year 9 3,500. And at the end of the academic year, they handed that essay in, but it wasn't levelled, it was commented on. And then they used that essay and all the learning from across the year to put forward a 15-minute presentation. And that presentation was to a panel. It was a panel consisting of parents, their form teacher, and 2 peers from their class who were reporting back on their progress throughout the year, and a member of the local community. So it could have been a school governor, or a local police officer, or a shopkeeper, or anyone from the local community. And what we were trying to do was to get children really being able to articulate their learning and feel confident standing up in front of people to articulate that learning. We thought if they could do that in that setting, then they could do it to an Ofsted inspector, they could do it to a job interview, they could do it, you know, for an Oxbridge interview. That the confidence to articulate and have and believe in your learning was key. But none of it was levelled, none of it was on a data spreadsheet, but it made a huge impact to those children across the curriculum. But it was a challenge. It was a challenge in timetabling. It was a challenge in winning parents' hearts and minds to believe in it. And a challenge, obviously, to get the children to have the self-belief and confidence that they could do all that work and achieve it.
That is amazing. I love that idea. But a few things that are jumping out at me, and I just want to kind of like delve into them a little bit more, Debra, is when you said it was put into the curriculum, how much time did you set aside for introducing that? Because, you know, to do it well, and it sounds like you did do it to a really high standard, how did you set aside the time to fully embed it into the curriculum so that all kind of like subjects were partaking in it?
Yeah, well, not all subjects partook in it. It was very much English, drama, RE, PHSE, citizenship, those subjects, although other subjects dipped in and out with areas of expertise when it was relevant to the particular text or the particular theme. We started planning it the year before I was actually even working at the school. So I met with the head teacher, the senior management team, and then a group of teachers who stepped forward to volunteer to teach this, which was also important, that it wasn't imposed on people, that the pilot year was done with volunteers. And we did about 5 or 6 days worth of training and planning on that, and then started running it in September. And of course, the first year it didn't run perfectly, but the head teacher trusted us to get on with it. We were allowed to make mistakes. We were allowed to step back and evaluate them. The kids still did really well, but obviously in the second year there were things that we'd learned that we didn't repeat. But I think there has to be a culture of trust, and there has to be the confidence amongst a staff body to take some risks and to try and be creative. And that comes from a steer from senior leaders, I think.
So what were your key lessons that you've learnt? Because you just hinted that there were a few things that you changed as you went along. So if somebody else was thinking, wow, this is a really great way of asking those, well, getting children to think of those big questions and applying their knowledge to it and making judgments and evaluations, what were the key things that you would say, don't ever do this, or think about doing this, or for the future, we're even thinking about doing this?
I think initially we made an assumption that changing the curriculum and the assessment structures on their own were enough, and they weren't. There definitely needed to be more attention paid to pedagogy. So over the course of the first year, we very much honed down onto 3 areas of pedagogy that we felt were making the difference. And they were articulacy, autonomy and activity. And then we built in extra CPD sessions, not just for these staff, but also across the school that kind of focused on the importance of those. I think I would have liked to have had time, more planning time actually within the year. One of the difficulties of taking a group of teachers from across the curriculum is that meeting times are often allocated to departments, but this kind of sat outside of a department. So there were those kinds of things. But generally speaking, it went really well. But I would have, with hindsight, I would have focused on the pedagogy up front and more clearly, I think.
And did you see any unexpected benefits that you probably weren't anticipating?
Yes, I think particularly for children who perhaps came in, at a lower level. Everybody said we can see that this has got stretch and challenge, and that the most able will do really well. The level of vocabulary that was expected of them, and so on. We could see that the high flyers would do really well. But there were lots of children in that academic year. I mean, I had, for example, one girl coming in with reading and writing at a high level 1. And she was expected to write a 2,000-word essay, and she did. She didn't quite make 2,000 words. She made 1,500 words. But we had to scaffold it for her very obviously carefully and clearly with sentence starters and pictures to stimulate her thinking. But when she stood up and spoke, bearing in mind she barely ever spoke, with any degree of confidence, she was so proud at having achieved that. So I think my worry had been that it would knock the confidence of the children who were considered to be low achievers, but it actually really boosted their confidence more than anybody else's, I think.
Wow, I really love that idea. I just think it's absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Debra. Okay, so now let's switch up the pace and move on to our inspiration rounds. And it's an opportunity for us to explore with you, Debra, your best educational resources so that we can add value to others in our field. Is that okay with you?
Yes, absolutely.
So I'd like to shine the light on you, and I'd like to discover what was your proudest moment in education.
Probably my proudest moment was delivering that, assessment, or supporting the delivery of that assessment model. But then there are little golden moments just from individual lessons. And I think I really advocate to teachers to keep on reading about research or the ideas that are emerging about education, because it's constantly changing. And I just read a book by Susan Golding Meadow about how our hands help us learn. And I was teaching year 9. It was English. We were looking at what a metaphor was, basically. And I had a child in my class who constantly put his hand up, but then could never articulate his answer. And he was he was a little bit of a Fred sometimes, in the sense that if you didn't go to him for that answer, he would kick off, and then there'd be all sorts of disruption. So habitually, I would ask a question. He'd put his hand up. I'd ask him what the answer was. He'd say he didn't know, and we'd move on. But this time I noticed that his hands were moving, and I'd asked if anyone could tell me what a metaphor was. And his hands were moving. And instead of moving on, I asked him to look at his hands and explain what was happening. And he was kind of moving them in a shape that was a bit like a vase. Or it could have been a woman's body. Wrong. That kind of hourglass shape. And he kind of looked at his hands and he was puzzled, and he thought for a little bit, and then he said, a metaphor's like a vase or a vessel for carrying meaning.
Oh, wow.
Such a beautiful moment. And it could have gone horribly wrong. He could have been thinking about something completely inappropriate. But it just made me realise that sometimes we have to slow down and pay attention and watch for what's going on physically with children as well as what's coming out of their mouths.
I think sometimes as educators, we just want to kind of check that their understanding is there. So we ask them the question and then it kind of comes out and we go, yep, that kid understands. And then we're too quick to move on. But yeah, I really love that. But it could have been a nightmare.
You never know, do you?
So let's move on to the best advice you've ever received.
I had a really lucky break when I was an NQT. My head of department sent me on a course to work with Dorothy Heathcote. I don't know if you've heard of Dorothy, but she was a lecturer in education at Newcastle University and a bit of a guru about using drama in the classroom, and really kind of rigorous, high-level dialogic talk within that drama as well. And she told me that you should always start with where the child's at, not where you want them to be at. And it made me reconsider that whole thing about, setting lesson objectives or rushing through curriculum content, kind of finding out where a child is at, is the single most important thing. And we don't spend enough time finding out what they already know, what they already feel confident with, what they want to know, what their fears and worries and questions are. And over that 21 years that I've been teaching, it's never been time wasted to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of the year getting to know those children.
Well, I've been considering something similar along that phrase that you've just shared with us, and it's kind of like looking at assessment. And when you look at assessment, you're always kind of like trying to, what grade does the child want? What expectation do we have for them? What objectives are we setting for them? And I was kind of thinking recently, at any point, when do we actually ask them, what do they actually know about what we're going to be learning? Because, you know, I don't know what's going on in that kid's home life all the time. I don't know what they're doing in the community. I don't know what they've been, I know this sounds silly, but what they've been watching on TV and what they've learned from there. So trying to understand, before we even dive into the learning, where that child is coming from, we might discover some really fascinating aspects of that child. And also, wouldn't it just simply help us to just tailor the learning a bit more to those individual children?
Yeah. And there are, you know, over the years, I've been astonished at levels of expertise that children have had, that they've maybe gained from parents or family communities, or just an obsession by, you know, looking things up on the internet about something they've been interested in. And if you tap into that, their peers are more excited by their passion in some ways than they are by yours. So, you know, if you can find a child in your class that has a passion for something you're going to be teaching, then they can often just ignite that interest in other children as well.
Excellent. So let's move on to your sources of inspiration, Debra.
Well, Dorothy was a clear source of inspiration for me. She was just so widely read. I think sometimes people dismiss drama pedagogically as something that is, I don't know, sort of a soft skill or the Mickey Mouse subject in the curriculum. But her knowledge was absolutely vast, and she would be able to tap into anything to kind of bring it to life for children. And she was just hugely inspirational. But then, you know, I found a lot of inspiration on Twitter and through social media and connecting with people that way. You know, reading people's blog posts and having my thinking challenged. So, you know, it's not always comfortable reading, but that's certainly pushed my thinking forward. So tapping into those networks has been important. And then there are people like, you know, Mick Waters, Tim Brighouse, those kinds of, those men who have sort of been sidelined recently by recent governments, but whose knowledge and understanding and humanity is vast. And I think we should constantly keep on listening to their voices, because they ask some really pertinent questions about what children need.
And I think it was Sir Ken Robinson that said we need to focus on the whole person, not just their mind. So Dorothy, and being a drama teacher, definitely had it right by focusing on their mind and their body and considering that whole aspect of learning. Yes,
absolutely. And the more we learn about learning, the more we realise how intricately connected the body and the mind are. So I think, you know, we have to be really careful not to be making children too static and to disengage their bodies from their minds effectively.
So can you share with us now your personal teaching or education habit that works for you time and again?
Ooh, I find it really hard to kind of do this, because I wouldn't say that there's one thing that I do over and over again. But I think it's linked to that idea of making everything matter. Does that make sense? And so I think getting children to look at something that is really, really interesting, to really engage in a really deep way with it. I mean, pedagogically, the thing that I've come back to over and over again is mantle of the expert. And I've found that whatever it is that I have to teach, I always ask myself the question of who in the world would need to know this in order to do their job. And when I come up with the answer for that, that becomes the enterprise for our class. So we imagine that we are those people and we have to find that knowledge for some reason. And I find that always engages children, whether it's 4-year-olds who are looking to protect, you know, a pack of wolves from a cull in a forest, or whether it's 18-year-olds who are looking to help the prison service understand the differences between gender and language. It's always worked with me to hook kids in, to make it feel real and relevant and purposeful.
And do you have a resource that you can share with our listeners, internet, book or otherwise, that you think might add some value to their daily practice?
Yes, I'd recommend the book Oops by Howell Roberts. I think it's just a really It's a fun read, but it's got that kind of rigour and depth to it in terms of how do we get children to just fall into the trap of loving learning. And then if people are interested in, sort of drama as a pedagogy and Mantle of the Expert, then Tim Taylor and Luke Abbott run a website that collates a lot of ideas and planning and research. And that's just simply www.mantleoftheexpert.com.
So can you just break that down for our listeners, Debra? What is mantleoftheexpert.com and what can our listeners expect to see on there?
Well, in a nutshell, it was devised by Dorothy Heathcote, and it's simply an in-role, but it's not a threatening in-role. You're acting as yourself, but as if you were a doctor or as if you were, an anthropologist or an archaeologist or whatever. And it's asking the children to come together and form a responsible team to solve a problem. So they set themselves up as an enterprise. They might be a charity or an aid agency organisation or historians, whatever it is. And you as the teacher devise a problem, a client that needs help. And your learning kind of comes through the investigation of solving that problem and meeting the client's needs. So it's just a guise really for getting children feeling that there's some purpose and motivation to what it is they're learning.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. I'll have to go and check that one out myself and steal some ideas. So, Debra, it's been really wonderful having you on the show, and I'm so pleased that you joined me because I've learnt so much, and what you were doing with those big philosophical questions at school is just fantastic, and I definitely know that our listeners will learn so much from that. But before we say goodbye, how can our listeners connect with you?
Through Twitter, I do tend to share a lot of blog posts and writing and things through Twitter. So that's at Debra Kidd. And I also have a website, so www.debra-kidd.com. And they can email me from there and contact me from there.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Debra.
No problem. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.